Welcome to another episode of the Darkened Hour, and I'm your host, Adam Fitzgerald. And today with me is a first-time repeat visitor to the Darkened Hour, my co-host, Richard Cox. Richard, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me back, Adam,
in
this position as guest.
Absolutely. Richard, this episode basically is going to center around the Energy of Empire series, which touches on the history of Western imperialism and questions whether we live in the age of empires still, or have we evolved past this age? Yet, it seems through watching these episodes, we have not evolved. In fact, we continue to be the world empire. And in this series, you question the American political motivations under the administrations of William McKinley to Theodore Roosevelt, where you suggest the age of empire came to fruition around this period. And after watching most of these episodes, I could probably say that this is definitely the area to concentrate on in terms of where where U.S. imperialism started. And I like to start with episode 2, which is Hawaii, the Bayonet Constitution. And my question will be that you start off the series with the state of Hawaii and how a businessman of the sugar and pineapple industries and prominent lawyer, Lauren Thurston, who led the Annexation Club and overthrew Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani in 1893, which was backed by the U.S. military, which resulted in the provisional government of Hawaii controlled by Thurston's committee, and that the treaty was not ratified under President Cleveland, however, but by July of 1898, the annexation formed the Treaty of Hawaii under President McKinley. This was the first foreign government the United States federal government forcibly overthrew. And you asked the question, had President Cleveland had foreseen the implications of this event and whether this was the death of the Republic? Is that what happened here?
Yeah, well, in some ways, no, because it's an arbitrary starting point, right? And the United States did not become an empire when it ultimately annexed Hawaii. The United States had been an empire long before through the Indian Wars, the war with Mexico, and you could also say the Secessionist War or the Civil War with the South. But now the eagle spreads its wings overseas, and that makes it kind of obvious, right? Because there's kind of an inevitability of scuffles with Indian tribes, and the winner, the outcome is kind of going to be inevitable there. So in starting with Hawaii, I was looking for a jumping in point to history, because you could just go, obviously every historical event comes to the one before, so you could end up with the origins of the universe if you're not careful. So I committed what Scott Horton calls the salt water fallacy, that an empire only becomes an empire when it goes overseas, because that period just after Hawaii provokes this great debate in the United States of do they become an imperial power, or are they going to stand by the Republic? And what happened in Hawaii, it kind of set up a template where a group of local Hawaiians overthrew the government, and the Hawaiian government then could have taken power back, but the US Marines arrived and said, look, we're not fomenting a coup here, but you can't be hurting American citizens and you can't be arresting and harassing them. So we're just going to send the Marines in to look after the Americans who are also engaged in a coup. And that's a copy and paste template later on for Nicaragua and Honduras around 15 years later. So it's a coup that's on a coup. That was under the administration of Benjamin Harrison. When Grover Cleveland later came back into power, Cleveland was not opposed to a bit of imperialism for financial gain, like supporting American companies abroad, but he was opposed to this ripping up of the Constitution and wholesale going and overthrowing governments. And he was outraged by this to the point of sending a warship to Hawaii and threatening to open fire to restore Queen Liliuokalani. Now, he backed down, and my wondering was, had he seen the direction the United States was going to move as a consequence of that, would he have made a different decision? Because it is a crucial point, and what follows in the years 1898, the war with Cuba and the Philippines, although the United States was already an empire, there is a bit of a fork in the road where the United States goes one way and not the other and becomes the global empire it is today.
You you also detailed how the United States government erased the history of Hawaii by replacing the language, the schooling, and even the overall identity. Besides taking over the country for other reasons, such as the farming industry, the corporate benefits, and of course, the benefit for the U.S. military this was about the start of U.S. imperialism, was something more. What was this like the overall catalyst for the future of the United States federal government in regards to taking over the smaller islands in the Pacific? And
Yeah,
was this about strategy or strategic importance, or was it about, say, obtaining minerals?
strategically, absolutely. I mean, I see most of these things as a combination of different interests. There's usually an economic corporate interest. There's usually an ideological pursuit of just wanting to have an empire. And there's usually some geostrategic benefit. And Hawaii is geostrategically crucial because the major markets are China. Even back then, there's like 200 million Chinese, I think, back at the turn of the 20th century. And American manufacturers and producers wanted that market. Well, Hawaii is the coaling station. It doesn't get you all the way to China, but you certainly need Hawaii to get the rest of the way to a Japanese island or something to coal up again. So absolutely. And then it takes on a military significance too for future wars, the invasion of the Philippines. So yeah, geostrategy, absolutely. The educational point you make, that's really a continuation of the Indian Wars and is common to other empires like Britain in South Africa or the Japanese in Korea, the erasure of language and culture, and often carried out by people who feel they're doing a benevolent thing, right? Who have a vision of the world where, in this case, white Anglo-Saxon culture is the best. That's obviously demonstrated by the 19th century and technology in their minds. And we need to get these primitive backward people in the schoolhouse, and it might be hard on them. They might feel attached to their culture, but if we can knock that out of them, it's all for the good. And there's actually a cartoon of Uncle Sam instructing a classroom of native children and waving a big stick at the time. He's going to thrash their tribal habits out of them and bring them kicking and screaming into the modern world. So yeah, and then obviously Hawaii takes on this much greater geostrategic significance of the war with Japan. And just after I made the episode, actually, Abby Martin did a whole load of reporting on the Hawaiian water being poisoned by the fuel depots.
Yes.
Now, if what's it called, Pearl Harbor, so that just broke afterwards. It's a major thing, that the consequence of the that invasion back in, or not invasion, annexation back in 1893. Well, yeah, invasion really. Is Hawaiians today are suffering from it, drinking poison water now.
Yeah, look, we could fast forward to today's period regarding what is happening in the past. Is that they're much more subtle. It just seemed they were much more primitive and out with their agendas in terms of like political motivations or their racial motivations. They're much more subtle now, and it's much more covert now in terms of
they probably felt they were being subtle then as compared to what people had said 50 or 100 years before that. So there is this, even then the word empire is going out of fashion a bit. Certainly in the United States, they have to make an effort to say we're not one of those European empires. We're pursuing the large policy, right? So this is now you would call this internationalism or something, or you'd say no, we have a responsibility to protect or something like that. The language gets more subtle with time. But for us to look back on like Theodore Roosevelt, he seems like an absolutely unfiltered imperialist who is just, I suggest, like, if you want to know what modern politicians, I say Dick Cheney, are thinking, you might look at what Theodore Roosevelt was saying, because he could say it then. Not quite they're not quite literally the same thing, but the pattern, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Also, let's go to chapter 3. That's Cuba. You stated that President Theodore Roosevelt was indeed rather sociopathic, as you alluded to here as well. One instance that stood out to me was that he said this about Mark Twain: "I'd like to skin Mark Twain alive." Also, Roosevelt resigned from his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy so he can insert himself into the war in 1898. Is this how Roosevelt saw himself, as some leading figure in terms of getting the United States as the preeminent power by any means necessary?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt Theodore Roosevelt is the craziest person to ever become president of the United States. Whatever else he might be, the
That's what
leader.
I
Or
got
not.
from your episode.
Yeah, and people at the time recognized it. Like, he was actually put in the position of vice president to keep him away from doing damage in other areas. And there's a Republican Party member at the time, Mark Hanna, said, like, you've put, anything happens to McKinley, this lunatic is going to be
Right.
Yeah, but just, I mean, amazing quotes about him. The way I try and get into the mindset is, I think he seems to, like when I was a kid, there were computer games like Civilization. Okay, we have to build a civilization, then you can go to war with other civilizations, and you don't feel sort of morally bad about building battleships and tanks and sailing them across the sea and taking over some other civilization because it's pixels on a screen, right? And you're not concerned necessarily about the individual lives of people in those imaginary cities. You're concerned about the destiny of your great civilization. Well, because essentially you're recognizing there's a level difference between me, the player, and the imaginary pixels that aren't really alive. And that's the way I can maybe access a bit of Theodore Roosevelt's mindset and people like him, is he's the player of the game. And the game is, what's important is the destiny of nations. It's not about individuals. That would be seen as a very wishy-washy kind of philosophy. So with that in mind, like, Roosevelt became more and more opposed to free markets as he went on, because free markets produce things like comfortable sofas to sit in and luxury items people want, but they don't serve the destiny of nations. They don't make you great on the stage. So to me, it's a kind of acting out of an impulse to manifest oneself, but with no sense of boundary to that, with no sense that you don't have the right to drag a nation into that and go and engage in a violent war. So yeah, really revealing as the kind of empire en masse, like what people say about Donald Trump, that Donald Trump did us a favor in a sense, because Donald Trump's a bit like the empire unmasked. You know, he lacks the kind of sophistication of a Barack Obama, who can put a nice, intellectually refined face on the empire.
Right. Exactly right. So I think this is a great comparison, because what we saw with Obama was a handsome man, very well articulate, Harvard constitutional professor. And on the other hand, we have this reality star who's grotesque in every other way, can't hide it. And yet this is exactly the dual face you're talking about in terms of American imperialism. And these are just presidents, okay? These are not the real influential dangers to society. They're just the spokesman chosen to be the spokesman for people that don't want to be seen and heard. And I just the psychology. I think what under all these episodes is something I remarked to you before we started recording, was the underlying message here is about the psychology of the federal government.
Well, an aspect of it. So I've called it the energy of empire, because energy is a broad, all-embracing term, and that's in contrast to a conspiracy vision of history, okay, which posits like a small group of actors are pulling the strings. And I'm not saying that's not true, but it's one aspect of a totality that continuously recreates this pattern of empire. And psychology is, of course, another major aspect of that.
Yeah, and just to harp on that chapter with Cuba, this seems to be a glimpse of the beginning of modern day imperialism, and Roosevelt's Rough Riders advanced to Kettle Hill in 1898 to capture Cuba. This could be seen as the Army. The Rough Riders are the Army's 3rd Infantry Division. It's similar to the Army's 3rd Infantry Division of Baghdad in 2003. Yet you couldn't really discern any major differences between the two besides the technological means. Has this always been the case regarding the U.S. government and their need to have a continuous state of war?
Yeah, for a whole host of reasons. For the economic setup, this belief that you need to find expanding markets overseas, the way that corporations can essentially buy politicians to do their bidding, the way you have a kind of ruling class drawn from an elite who share those interests, the way you have ideology, imperialistic ideology, all these forces come together, and then the war machine itself becomes a self-perpetuating thing. So, when the Cold War goes, that was just not long after what's the name of the Fifth Fleet, the Middle Eastern Command had been set up there. So that has to find different justifications, because the Red Army aren't going to pour into Iran anymore. So you have these self-sustaining bureaucracies. So yeah, totally. And the land invasion of Cuba was actually a disaster. It didn't win the war at all. The American army was used to fighting wars against Plains Indians, so they all fell off the boat when they arrived at Cuba and didn't know how to disembark. And then they all got sick of yellow fever, and it was a complete disaster. So it's the Navy, the advanced American Navy, won the war at sea. But you also have this factor with the Spanish-American War, which that's what the invasion of Cuba was. They were fighting Spain over Cuba, was a way of unifying the country after the Civil War, if you allow me to call it that. Because North and South were very divided at the time, so there was this conscious effort to bring old Southern generals. A few of them were still kicking about, apparently, and they were brought in to fight alongside the Northern generals and command the army. And wars have acted to have a unifying effect on the United States since then, because there's this, people individually are more bound together by an external threat than they are by common similarities. So same with the nation state. When you have these constant external threats you have to go off and manage, it nullifies the internal differences between the states. And that was quite consciously spoken about at the time. No one says that anymore, right? No one says, oh yeah, the reason we go to war is to stop like a civil war breaking out in the United States again, or to stop the kind of climate you see now. But that was just very openly admitted to at the time.
Well, look, just to follow up on terms of the Civil War, I mean, in this country, I don't see it as like a civil war that we've seen in the 18th century. I think what we're going to see in the future is basically more of a riot in terms of speak, like small pockets of resistance in cities and based on fringe conspiracy and also political division. I think that's right now I want to say the most antagonistic item in the United States is politics. It's such a, I'm 52. I don't think I've ever seen the country more divisive in regards to politics than they are at any point.
Yeah, so my speculation is that these patterns tend to recreate themselves. And you would have seen another civil war in the United States by now, had it not been for technology. So if there was still a 19th century level of technology, there would have been, but now it's like we're living in a world that we can't really predict how these things play out, but we can't predict they'll happen. And there is a kind of warlike feeling. I would suggest when people have complete contempt for people on the opposite side of the political spectrum and a total refusal to engage with their viewpoints at all and are totally locked into their own media narrative, you are kind of at war at that stage, but you're just fighting that war through a ballot box where you're trying to get your guy to win so he can dominate the other side and keep them down. It's not about creating a consensus in society. So, and you see this like in Canada with the trucker protest. In a sense, like Justin Trudeau stopped being a legitimate leader at that point because you have to keep also, you win a democratic mandate if these things make any sense at all. To the extent they make any sense at all, you might win it from less than 50% of the population, but you have to stay within a realm that keeps the overwhelming majority of the population on board, even the people that didn't vote for you and are ideologically opposed to. When you step outside of that, you've lost any claim to a democratic mandate, really. So I would say that's probably the case in the United States now. So there is a kind of civil war going on. It's just a case of how does that play out with 21st century technology?
You know, I want to jump back to that chapter of Cuba because I found something very interesting, is that you mentioned about Henry Cabot Lodge as saying that if Spain did not withdraw from Cuba, the United States would declare war. And of course, this was not about actually liberating Cuba, frankly, but more about colonizing Cuba, just not publicly. Could you talk more about this?
Yeah, well, initially, the American government was happy to have Spain rule Cuba because American business interests had access to the islands through that. And if the Cuban rebels overthrew the Spanish government, well, then you could have land redistribution or anything could go on. And so it's a very unstable board then. So it seems like at some point the figures in the US government and the business world lost faith in the Spanish government's ability to hold the islands in this most recent of rebellions that was going on. So then the war was based on this, what we would now call a humanitarian intervention or a responsibility to protect. The Spanish are committing all sorts of atrocities against Cubans. Some of that was entirely true. And it was entirely also built up beyond that in the American press. And that was the justification. But obviously the real reasons were commercial interests and geostrategic. Again, particularly Puerto Rico is the first bit of land you encounter if you're going to the Americas, so it's geostrategically significant. If you want to further incursions into Latin America, very good islands to hold, and yeah, commercial with you can just see the commercial with the what the American government did to the economy of sugar, the economy of Cuba afterwards, with the devaluation of the currency and the taking over the sugar plantations and so on, and being held by a very small number of American businessmen, and the annexation of Puerto Rico, which that one I didn't know anything about. I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico at all prior to doing the series, so that was a real revelation to me. See the annexation of Puerto Rico and then just conscripting men to fight in the First World War. So you're suddenly told you have to go and fight for this foreign government. Imagine being a Puerto Rican islander, you're suddenly sent off to the far side of the world to fight against Germans. It's crazy. So yeah, it was entirely self-serving reasons, of course.
Sure, and that jumps right into the next question, because that's what I have a question for you.
Right.
It seems that Roosevelt didn't even waste any time here. He almost immediately after the end of the Spanish-American War in Cuba, and just 8 days after it gained independence, Puerto Rico was next. And what benefits did Puerto Rico possess, which gave the United States any reason to militarize it?
Yeah, well, more of the same in terms of plantations there. I do think Theodore Roosevelt just wanted it because it was there. I don't think he had any great reason for it necessarily. Right. Yeah. And it is kind of geostrategic. It's the most eastward land in the Caribbean. So it's, and it has been, I think it was Puerto Rico that was used for the launching pad for the invasion of Panama later on in the 80s. And it's been a military testing ground. The island of Vieques has been bombed to smithereens over the years, with all sorts of pollution effects on the population, cancers in the population. And actually, at the start of the series, I knew that went on, but I didn't know how widespread it was. But it's like everywhere, like Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, all the Okinawa. Like there's so many pollution problems and high rates of cancer around these American bases.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I wasn't so clued into the sheer extent of the environmental problems they create. This vast base network around the world.
How long has that been going on?
How long is the bombing?
The bombing and the pollution.
Well, I suspect it's a post-World War II. I don't know exactly, but I'm going to suspect it's a post-World War II thing, because the United States didn't have a huge standing army prior to that, or a huge air force. So that certainly with the Bikini Islands out in the Pacific, they were tested with nuclear bombs in the post-World War II era, and the people there were essentially human guinea pigs in radiation experiments. So American doctors come along and say, "Oh yeah, we've got this treatment we're giving you," and it wasn't a treatment at all. They were just coming along to monitor like how quickly they were dying after they had the nuke set off on them.
Lord, you also stated that Roosevelt granted them citizenship, but he didn't do it out of his own good heart. It seems he wanted to conscript them into the U.S. military to serve in World War I.
That was Woodrow Wilson.
That was a
bit later on.
Sorry, Wilson, right? Sorry.
So this is right in 1916 when they get their citizenship. Right. It's like, oh joy! I wonder why you've got that.
Yeah, I wonder.
Here's a rifle, off to Germany with you.
It also became a tax haven, I believe.
Yeah. Well, it's in absolute financial dire straits today. I can't remember the figure of the debt they have there, but it's I think it's like half as wealthy as the poorest US state. So it's diabolically run for the past 100 years.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, I know I have personal friends that are from the mainland of Puerto Rico,
right?
And I had not known anything about the dire position that the island is in. And it just seems to me that a lot of that area is very underrepresented in media or in schools in terms of history. And I think I know why, is because of the history that we're alluding to here today.
Yeah, well, a lot of Puerto Ricans report this experience of coming to the United States and meeting Americans who don't understand their status. They think Puerto Rico is a foreign country or something, and it is
Right,
kind of confusing because what is it? It's a territory. What like
right,
do countries have territories these days?
right.
It's a very 19th century concept.
Yeah, it's outdated.
Totally, yeah. It's
It's
amazing it
outdated.
goes on. Yeah,
So
Guam is kind of the same, but the older people in Guam don't despise their American overlords so much because however bad the Americans were, the Japanese were worse, right? And the
yeah,
Americans got rid of the Japanese, so that's a bit of a different cultural setup.
right. See now, look. After all, this is this period of gaining the islands itself. We see like a jump to more progressive ideas of demilitarizing or destabilizing threats to the imperialist nature of the United States. So I fast forward to your chapter in Japan. Now, in this chapter, you duly noted that during the 16th century, Japan had suppressed any Western influence, which included the spread of Christianity.
Yeah.
One film in particular I saw by Scorsese, and I can't remember the name of the film. Liam Neeson's in it, and it was a fantastic film. And it was about the suppression of Christianity in the country. The reason was because Japan saw Christianity as a wicked ideology, where they also saw this as a probe of the West to probe whether the country was weak or not. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. That's so Japan has this like 100-year warring states period in the 1500s, and then finds this 250-year period of stability under the Tokugawa dynasty, shogunate. Then and during that period, Christians in the early 1600s have been traveling Japan, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, I think that's how you say it, he booted them all, and it was only a few Dutch traders were allowed in, and Japanese ships had to have like shallow bottoms, so they couldn't sail across the sea because they just decided there was nothing out there worth seeing. And that, yeah, the Christians, they saw it as European powers would probe a country to find out if it was militarily strong or weak, and if it was weak, they'd take over, and if it was strong, they'd send in the Christians to convert the population and subvert them, and then take over by more subtle means. So there was this ban until, well, Japanese banned all foreigners until the 1850s, when the US warships rolled in and insisted that they open their ports then.
Right, and the name of the film was actually called Silence, based upon Christian missionaries that visited the island. When Japan invaded Taiwan and China, the US saw this as a chance to side with Japan as an extension of future US imperialism. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt saw Japan as the imperial rival, where you speculated that this may have led to the attack of Pearl Harbor and whether or not the US had advanced knowledge. But quite a remarkable charge, but nevertheless unsurprising considering how they saw Japan, like they do with Russia during the Cold War.
Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt saw Japan as a potential imperial partner, like a junior partner in Eastern Japan. The Japanese played a clever game with the restoration of the emperor, that they saw that they couldn't strengthen themselves enough to resist American encroachment. So they adopted not only Western technology, but also a lot of Western cultural norms, and got kind of adopted as honorary Aryans. I think that's the name of the part of the chapter of the podcast I did. And Theodore Roosevelt liked this kind of thing. And there was jiu-jitsu wrestlers visiting the United States and doing matches for him against American wrestlers, and this was all kind of very interesting to him. And so he appreciated the Japanese Bushido culture really spoke to him. Okay, and yet he saw Japan as a way that potentially they could get a further coaling station to go into China, and also as a bulwark against Russia. So in Roosevelt's mind, like, he's playing a zero-sum game, like an imperialist off and on, that the world is finite in scope, and at some point with the rise of technology, a culture is going to come to dominate. Okay, and we want it to be the Anglo-Saxon culture because that's the best one, clearly. So we want Anglo-Saxon legal norms to be across the world, and we don't want the major potential rival would be the Slavic people, Russia. So just look at the size of the country at that point and their resources. Russia was rapidly industrializing at the time, and this has always been like perhaps the major Western threat. You can like see it back in the Crimean War, and you see it today, right? You see it in Afghanistan in the 80s. We need to keep Russia down, and you see it's going on in the Ukraine now. The world is again fighting a proxy war with Russia. So Britain actually signed an alliance with Japan in the just at the beginning of the 20th century, which is an unusual thing for Britain to do at the time. They didn't like entangling alliances, and they supplied them with warships. And Theodore Roosevelt, and this is amazing, right? But he couldn't sign an alliance or a treaty at the time. That would be unthinkable for a US president, because the United States is completely opposed to entangling alliances. And then World War II happens and you're in NATO, and that's that. But yeah, the idea was to use the Japanese to keep the Russians out of Manchuria, out of China, and keep the Chinese markets open to the West, which they successfully did. But they created a bit of a monster in doing it. And then at some point there was this shift in attitudes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had family connections back to China and thought more favorably of them. And then when the Japanese are acting quite brutally in China, that came back, and it did. You can see this. I don't blame, place the entirety of the blame on Roosevelt and the encouragement the Japanese got from this. It has to obviously fall squarely on the Japanese imperialists, but you can sort of look back to the Roosevelt presidency and see the origins of the Second World War.
I do want, let me follow up on this, Richard, because I think this is something that we've touched on before, and it's something that is a prominent face at the table in terms of conversation about world history, and that in terms of conspiracy theory, and that by the turn of this century, there are people who are still today prominent, and one of them is Alex Jones, in regards to who's actually controlling the world in terms of like war, for example, and imperialism. And you have anywhere between the Illuminati, so to speak, or the the banking industry led by the Rothschild family, and even the more egregious, more fanatical in terms of like alien life forms visiting and telling certain people and congressional delegations what to do in terms of depopulizing the world. Is there any semblance of truth in any of these at all, or is basically these can just be dismissed as irrational speak?
Well, how would you categorize all the stuff we just talked about him? Because I would say all of that is fairly conspiratorial. Okay, you have Theodore Roosevelt engaging in secret diplomacy with Japan to be a proxy force, and you have people in the kind of social clubs of the Eastern establishment conspiring to, okay, Mr. Hearst, you get the newspapers on board for this war with Cuba, and Mr. Lodge is in Congress, he'll rally around the troops there, and then we'll put forward this message about how the Spanish are abusing Cuban women, and make sure they look white when you do the cartoons of them, because our boys won't want to fight for dark-skinned women. So this is all conspiratorial, right? So, I think straight away Alex Jones is more than half right in that. The world works in a much more conspiratorial way than is generally presented. Because I think a lot of biographies of Roosevelt don't talk about him as such a nefarious actor in this way, and so responsible for as an architect of the American empire. He's usually seen as somebody who did wonderful things in regulation of the meat industry or something, advanced kind of a more inwardly progressive agenda. So on that, and actually, as we record this, I've just done episode 11 on South Africa. Well, episode 12, I'm looking at the Anglo-American establishment, the concept of Cecil Rhodes. I've just popped over to British imperialism for a bit. I'll be heading back to the US as soon as possible. But the idea of Cecil Rhodes setting up a secret society with the aim of taking over as much of the world as possible. And that's a thing that he tried to do, okay? And obviously, I think most conventional historians don't think it got very far because they don't talk about it. But there's a contingent who think that Cecil Rhodes's Society of the Elect or the Anglo-American establishment have been the defining force in 20th century history. Now, as I sit here today, I tend to think that's going too far. What I tend to think you have is a kind of continuity of ideology, that different people under different times come into a similar ideology of wanting to expand power and of wanting to set up these global government bodies so that their ideology, which is, of course, as far as they're concerned, is the right one, the best one, can reach out across the world for good and ill. So that I tend to see it more that way than you've had a continuous one group of people. Now, but I am very, this is in some ways, for me, doing the series is a way to challenge myself on that and say, okay, is it a bit more conspiratorial than I think? Are there more consistent groups? Because like you say about the Rothschild family, well, I think a lot of the Rothschild conspiracy theories come from fabricated quotes, like, and a lot of conspiracy theorists don't seem to check quotes when it suits their agenda. Okay, to think that Nathan Rothschild took over the entire British economy in 1815 by having his runners come back from the Battle of Waterloo with information that Wellington lost ahead of anyone else. Like, so on another series I'm doing on conspiracy, I checked that story and it first appears like 40 years later coming out of the mouth of a French socialist. Right, so no one in London at the time mentioned this, that Rothschild had just taken over the entire British economy. It comes out of a French socialist who didn't really like wealthy Jewish banking families very much. And that you find this, that every time somebody misattributes a quote to Rothschild, some sort of cartoonish villain quote, that will just enter conspiracy literature, like straight off, as if it's a true thing. And of course, like our ancestors wrote satire. They made shit up, right, in all the ways we do. And there's that, when you start to simplify and take all that out, then you can start to get into conspiracy theories, which I think have a lot, have like far too much continuity in terms of the groups. But I'm willing to be like challenged on that.
Yeah, and this series definitely does, because when I was watching your series in the last 2 weeks, I was thinking both of the more historical aspects and what little we do know, because like you said, there is a concentrated effort in keeping this history from us. But secrets are hard to keep, and yes, some history does leak out. But at the same time, we're met with a tsunami of disinformation, and with that comes these fringe conspiracies. I consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I think you do too. But we're a limit in terms of that. We're not fringe conspiracy theorists. One who just advocates speculation, which is basically irrational speculation, as opposed to rational speculation in terms of conspiracy theory. I think that's the defining line regarding ourselves. And this series itself, you have to entertain the fact that, wow, there is conspiracy in terms of history, but where does the limit draw the line? Because we're awash with people like Alex Jones and disinformation that comes from it. Now, the reason why he's still relevant is, like you said, is because he does speak on relevant and truthful facts, but they are very minute. And that's what keeps him relevant, because more than 3/4 of the time, he's acting a fool and spreading these false theories.
Well, it helps because he simplifies things, right? He speaks with a megaphone, both literally and symbolically, And for Alex Jones, there's this kind of simple enough narrative where it's all the Illuminati or whatever. It's all the New World Order agenda. And I think the nuance for me is that life never consists of just one pole on anything. Okay, so I'm doing a series on which really focuses on the United States, but I certainly don't wish to infer by that the United States is the great Satan and it's going around the world smashing all these wonderful liberation movements. That's partly true, but these liberation movements themselves often turn out just as bad or worse as the big empire they're trying to break free from. So they're not necessarily desirable people, and that's where you see like there's a polarization of left and right, whereas to people on the kind of hard right, all these left-wing movements across the world are communist insurgencies funded by Moscow, and the CIA is doing the right thing and smashing them. And there's no nuance in that, where you have people who really believe a little country like Nicaragua poses a threat to the southern border of the United States, because they just see things with that one lens. And communism, I would say, is an evil philosophy that has built up mountains of corpses, but not everyone that resists the US empire is a communist. And on the left, you have this view that the United States is the great evil, going around smashing liberation movements that are always for the good. Fidel Castro is a wonderful human being who's doing his absolute best for
Mm.
Cuba, even to the point of trying to reform Stalin and Mao. So you have this monopolar way of looking at the world, and that's true with conspiracy. That anything that, like, I could, and I'm sure you could, Adam, make some stuff up, and it would find its way into the conspiracy lexicon. If you fabricate a few Rothschild or Rockefeller quotes, okay, they could sift their way in and be accepted and be quoted in books and all sorts, and do the rounds, because there's a lack of awareness that they're very aware that power structures are corrupt and awful and seek to dominate and control, but they're not aware of the other pole, which is people make stuff up, people write propaganda. People have very low standards of evidence, and you have to have those like two poles, I think, to otherwise you just go off in an unlimited direction, an unlimited distance in one direction, and end up in Jonestown.
Fast forward to Nicaragua.
Mm.
General Alfonso Estrada Agron took over as Nicaragua's president when Jose Madriz went into exile. And in this chapter, you know that the New York Times reported on it, and the United States became the ultimate ruler of the country. But later, a rebellion broke out, and the U.S. Marines got involved and occupied the country for the next 20 years. Could you possibly elaborate on just how much the U.S. controlled the country at this point?
Well, essentially, I don't think it was absolutely true. There were elections in Nicaragua, but if things went too far out of kilter for the oligarchy, the Marines were sent in. And then the Somoza family took over and ran the country, I think, perfectly to the satisfaction of Washington until the 1970s, when there's an earthquake. Manuga is destroyed in that. And then you have the Sandinistas, who are named after Augusto Sandino, who was a rebel leader back in the 30s, who was murdered by the Somozas. They then come to power, and this civil war breaks out in Nicaragua, where, and this is really the deplorable thing that the US did, the Reagan administration did in that time, of essentially sponsoring terrorist groups and dressing them up as freedom fighters in the media. And again, just to refer to what I've just been saying a moment ago, that's not to, I try not to paint the Sandinistas as whiter than white freedom fighter heroes. They were going around conscripting people who didn't want to go fight for them into the army. They were running the economy in a way that it could only really fail. So there is a balance there, but they were not at the same time the puppets of Moscow, who were just looking to spread this evil empire across the world. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, because it leads up to the next one. And this is something that doesn't surprise me, because it seems that with the next administration, just things continually to get more worse in time. Because when Carter ordered CIA support for the labor unions and the press in Nicaragua, because the reason why was because they wanted Somoza and the National Guard intact.
Yeah.
However, when Reagan became president, he then supports the Contras, which led to the infamous mass murders of the Sandinistas and supporters. But after U.S. support was banned by Congress, the Reagan administration covertly continued it. And these activities, illegal activities, by the way, culminated in the Iran-Contra affair. And you talked about whether or not Reagan is evil in this episode. I think this would be the definition of it, no?
Well, that's an interesting point, right? There was something I resolved in my own mind only when I did the episode, because there is this theory that perpetuates in the John Birch Society that the US is secretly supporting all these communist regimes around the world, which is like bonkers. I mean, I think actually post World War II China, they make a kind of interesting enough case there. But in countries like Nicaragua, yeah. But one of the things they'll point to is Carter like giving some support to the Sandinistas when they came in, like letting the Somoza dynasty collapse and giving some support to the Sandinistas. And why would they do that? And is the State Department full of closeted communists who are? It would be like, that would be very strange if it was. And yeah, what it seems is that they were trying to keep the new administration on board and bring them into a position which was congenial to US corporate interests and US national security interests in the area. And then when that failed, the Reagan administration comes in, who were absolutely more militaristic and hard line and less
Oh,
likely
yeah.
to look for a diplomatic solution, yeah, then they start to sponsor the terrorists and do so illegally by shipping off weapons to Iran, and also by, I didn't go into this too much because it's like it's narco terrorism, narco imperialism is a whole nother, that's a series in itself, right? But yeah, by allowing the importation of drugs from Nicaragua to the United States and setting off the crack boom of the 80s.
Yeah. Incidentally enough, under the Reagan administration, we start seeing the very first elements of the Paul Nietzsche school of neoconservatism, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Donald Rumsfeld start, serving under the Reagan administration. And that's going to be on your future episodes, I'm pretty sure, because we see the expansion of U.S. imperialism come from there in regards to the Middle East and Southeast Asia, outside of the Pacific Islands, and of course Asia countries. And it just seems like there's a spiral going on in that area of the world in regards to taking control of the region itself, always in a perpetual state of conflict, it seems. And history seems to repeat itself. For example, you touched on this before in regards to U.S. backing of these right-wing, ultra-Orthodox or ultra-nationalist groups, such as what we did with Afghanistan in 1979 when the Soviets invaded the capital, Kabul. Like you said before, there is no winner here. Soviets are evil in its own right for their own agendas, but at the same time, we're fighting evil with evil because we actually spent billions of dollars. Fast forward to the current day, guess what we're doing? Once again, we're funding and training the ultra-nationalist, these right-wing neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine in the disputed territories of Lashchansk and Donbass against the evil Russian Empire. Meanwhile, the left won't basically say, that, yeah, we helped to facilitate this in 2014, but we're fighting the evil country in Russia. Is that what we're saying today, Richard?
Yeah, well, I wonder, Adam, if history really does rhyme, then that would mean 20 years from now, the United States will be invading Ukraine after Ukrainian right-wing nationalists set up some terrorist event in the United States. So I wonder if that'll happen. Yeah, no, it's entirely what we're seeing,
right.
Isn't it?
Well, what's that quote? To find out who tomorrow's enemies are, find out who we're funding today.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. And right-wing nationalists are a far more convenient terrorist nowadays than the Islamic population, because the Islamic population, there is a limit to the level of internal crackdown you can do when your enemy is Middle Easterners or Muslims, okay? Because there's just not that many of them in the United States. But if your enemy is right-wing nationalists, well, you can see them anywhere, right? Like you could be a right-wing nationalist.
There is no hidden agenda. See, it's funny you bring this up, because with Islamic fundamentalism, they were much more covert in terms of integrating within the society. Ultra-nationalists are very obtuse, very outwardly, and they're almost like they're proud to display it. And especially with the people they call themselves the Trumpers. They basically are nationalists in that regards. But they don't hide the fact that they are. They just come right out and say it. So that would make a much more obvious enemy itself in its own right.
Yeah, there's more of an overt kind of bellicose energy to it, isn't it? That's a split with the Republican Democrats in the 80s, the Reagan regime. The Democrats had a kind of a more subtle method of maintaining control, whereas Reagan's more of a send in the tanks kind of guy. So there is this, the political right has this more overt kind of energy to it. It's not so subtle and disguised and concealed. It doesn't do that so well.
Lawrence Wilkerson, when I interviewed him, basically said that in terms of the left, they'll bleed you until you die. The right just want to kill you.
Yeah, that's entirely it. Yeah,
exactly. So, fast forward to your latest episode, and boy, was this a heavyweight shocker, because I had no idea who Cecil Rhodes is, and boy, what a deplorable individual this man is. So, over the weekend, I saw your South Africa episode, and my question about this one is that you mentioned that Cecil Rhodes had raised the property requirements, which had a disproportionate effect on the previously growing number of enfranchised Black people in the Cape, under the Cape Qualified Franchise that had been enforced since 1853. by limiting the amount of land which Black Africans were legally allowed to hold to further disenfranchise Black population. And this had such a nefarious tone to it. Could you speak more about that?
Yeah, well, I just feel the need to explain why we're in South Africa and the British Empire all of a sudden after being in the US. So what I'm ultimately doing is I stopped the US series in 1912, just before Woodrow Wilson comes in, because there's a bit of a change of tone then to the empire. And I'm wanting to do the run into the First World War, obviously. And because that's a European affair, I'm just looking at, okay, where was the British Empire at this point? And then I'm going to rejoin that with when the United States becomes involved. So just starting like with the Boer War, really to explain the run into it, and this thing called the Anglo-American establishment, that Cecil Rhodes, essentially great British patriot that he was, attempts to set up a secret society to extend Anglo-American influence as far and wide as it can possibly go. And the first overt action of that was South Africa. So Rhodes is down there. He's actually funded by the Rothschilds, if you like your Rothschild conspiracies. And he's owning diamond mines down there, and he wants to use the Black population in kind of de facto slavery. Okay, so by limiting the their access to land, he can have them as compliant workers down the mines. So you see this kind of thing also with land restrictions, like Guatemala comes to mind. In one of the reasons there was a rebellion there in the 50s was United Fruit owned vastly more land than they used, and they owned it, so people couldn't use it. So then they have to work as slaves on the banana plantations. It's kind of standard thing. And after the war there, after Rhodes is dead, Lord Alfred Milner became governor of South Africa, and he essentially did the same thing with importing the Chinese on the kind of, you come over and you live in a nice city with a garden and everything, and you can work. And they were brought in as kind of slave labor to replace the to work down the mines then.
You know, you also mentioned in chat, which I found quite interesting, was that Rhodes actually used to sell ice cream to the miners itself.
Yeah, I lost the book that references in, so I just had to do it from memory. And then I found that, like, a few days I found, oh yeah, so I think that is true. Yeah, he figured out some way to use a steam engine from a train to set up refrigerators so he could sell ice cream to miners, and also the trains were used to pump water out of the mines. Yeah.
Well, that's incredible. I mean, he was 17 when he did that, which is,
yeah, he was,
and just an ingenious mind. It's like, I mean, the person himself is basically, I think, deplorable himself. But
very controversial figure in Britain now, because like there's.
Is he still? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because just in the way you have people taking statues down in the United States, Cecil Rhodes has a big statue at Oxford University because he gave a lot of money. That's part of his idea was to fund scholarships to Oxford, that people from around the empire and the United States and Germany, because he wanted to foster good relations with Germany, would be able to come and hopefully go away and live life in public service, but with this idea of unity, because he really wanted the United States back inside the British Empire in some way, maybe not called the British Empire anymore, but he thought that was like the absolute travesty that the United States had left in the 18th century. So the Rhodes scholarships were a way of just like bringing people into that ideology. Sure.
You you touch on the Rothschild family. So, I mean, it's funny because I'm really, I don't know how to basically gauge the Rothschilds in terms of influence, because so much is met by fringe conspiracy. And there's so little in terms of, I mean, we have a history regarding it, but how much of that history can be believed? Because we see the Rothschilds in the media as just a very wealthy, very affluent group that doesn't have a nefarious agenda. But they do have a nefarious agenda. And you mentioned this in the chapter here, because like you said, there was this part of the chapter in terms of South Africa was an extension of British imperialism, which was influenced by the Rothschild family backing Rhodes, because they helped to fund his diamond mines in the region. And you can't help but think that the Rothschilds saw this as a way to depopularize South Africa of the Black race, or basically raise the country for the mineral wealth, or a combination of all these things? Or is it basically about British imperialism for a global extension of their power as well? Or does all of this have any?
Well, I think they saw it primarily as a business investment, in the same way that banks lend money to oil companies today that might be doing not very nice things with the natives around the world. You know, so in that sense, the game hasn't changed. Certain members of the Rothschild family were in that idea of like the expansion of the British Empire. Certain members were very much for a kind of Zionist homeland for the Jews. Others were opposed to that. And other members became world famous botanists. You know, so there's like a complete diversity within the family. And like, this is an area that I may, like 2 years from now, have a completely different opinion on, right? But my sense with like the Rockefeller and Rothschild families is they are kind of what they're made out to be in conspiracy literature, in terms of them having this very long-standing, profound influence on the direction of the world as compared to your average pleb on the street. But I still think it's very small, right? I don't think that David Rockefeller goes into the president's, the Oval Office, and slams his fist on the table and says, this is the way it's going to be. And the same with the Rothschilds in Britain or else. I think they have a subtle influence, but you know, they're still kind of pawns in the game, right? Whereas we're not even in the game, you and I. We're just talking on a podcast that a few people are listening to, and you know, pretending that we're changing something here, you know. But I think the power is in the system itself. That is the overwhelming wave, this tidal wave, this vast energy that everyone is being carried along by. And if any of them stepped outside of that, then they wouldn't have any impact at all. So that's kind of how I view it.
I would think the same way, because I myself, when I studied 9/11, right? It was a very small area of history, but yet at the same time, there are many factors at play in regards to the overall structure of 9/11, why it was allowed to happen, instead of just, you know, facilitating it. You don't need to facilitate 9/11 when you already have a group of people basically willing to attack the United States, not because they hate you religiously, but because of your foreign policy, which you helped to facilitate in the years prior to demeaning these people or depopulating and destroying these people. All you have to do is basically just allow them to attack you, then capitalize on this and basically, you know, over-exaggerate the response. And that's something that we see with Israel and the Palestinians. You know, Palestinians will shoot a rocket into a neighborhood in Jenin or something, and basically they just come all with the military and just shower the area with bullets and missiles and whatnot. In terms of world history, in terms of our past and present, and probably the future, is that we're seeing a multitude of agencies and entities: the banking industry, the military industry, the foreign policy industry, corporate industry, private, all these separate from each other, but they work on a common goal, and they'll work together with each other. Intelligence agencies are the same thing too. But yes, they all have different influences of power, but they are limited in what they can empower. You, like, for example, you just brought up a great point. You know, you can't have Dave Rockefeller walk into the White House and basically bang his fist and say, this is the way it is. No, you'll have the director of the CIA or the World Bank, World Economic Forum, the World Banking Industry. They will basically not meet with each other, but they'll basically feed off each other and say, yeah, this is the way things are, and we'll work together with this in certain respects.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think that's the way the world.
I'll give you a couple of examples. One thing, the Rothschild family, the Rothschilds lost a lot of money with changes to inheritance tax in Britain in the post-First World War era. And a fair few of them died fighting in the Second World War. So I just think if they were really running the world, they probably wouldn't go get themselves killed in the wars they're supposed to be starting. So I do think it's so much. I read David Rockefeller's autobiography, right, which it's a surprisingly entertaining read. And there's a quote in there that anyone who engages in Rockefeller conspiracy theorizing, not illegitimately necessarily, but everyone brings that up, where Rockefeller says about how he's been instrumental throughout his life in trying to build a kind of closer global governance, one world order kind of system. But he starts out off by saying, like, Rockefeller's very aware that he's the subject of all these conspiracy theories, right? And the John Birch Society have got a real picking into him and that kind of thing. And he says, it's ridiculous what they say about me, that I'm building some global government or something. But then he seems to contradict himself, and he says, well, of course, I am working for international integration, and I'm proud of that. And it's kind of hard to make sense of it, because it does sound like he's contradicting them. What I think about that. Is Rockefeller, David Rockefeller himself does not perceive himself as a particularly powerful individual. He's a tiny cog in this vast machine. He's a bigger cog than you and me by a long way.
Yeah.
So I think he does probably downplay the level of influence he had. He certainly doesn't mention all the different things he was involved in his biography, which is kind of strange. And I wouldn't be surprised if coming out of his intelligence connections in World War II, he had a stronger kind of lifelong connection to the CIA, and his banking job was some kind of cover for that work to a degree, right? I really wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But like, I still think he's just a small part of a machine, right? And the machine is doing what it's going to do, irrespective of what David Rockefeller wants, or the Rockefeller family, or the Rockefeller and Rothschild, you know. They've got a very minor ability to direct the course the machine is taking, maybe a little, but not the overall direction, I would say.
So Richard, to basically end the episode here, what is your overall agenda in creating this series? What message do you want to bring to the people in regards to this series? And this series, you basically, it could go on and on, like you said, I think before we recorded, up to 100, and basically, you know, you probably could expand on that much more even. But what is your overall goal for creating this series? What do you want to bring to the people?
Well, really, to answer the kind of questions that we're speaking about today. Sometimes the things I'm saying to you, Adam, are like factual history, take it to the bank, and other things I'm clearly speculating. I'm saying, well, I don't think the Rothschild and this and that and the other, and they're this powerful but not that powerful. And it's for me to gain more clarification on that kind of thing. So I think the most interesting way to do these things is always go into it with the aim of educating yourself. And if you're having an interesting educational experience in doing it, then hopefully the audience can follow along and they'll have an interesting educational experience too. So that's the thing, really. And overall, I'm looking to understand myself how we've ended up in a world where 10 years from now, we're apparently all going to own nothing and be happy about that. This phrase that comes out of the World Economic Forum, like, how do we get there? How do we get in a place where it's completely clear that at the minute a virus is being used to reshape the face of the world, and for these global governance institutions to take power, as we're talking right now? There's this World Health Organization treaty where the World Health Organization is going to take the right to take control of a country's health services to various degrees when it declares a pandemic is going on. So does this all directly emanate from the mind of Cecil Rhodes in the 1890s? Does it all come from the Rothschild family in the 1790s? Or is it not that? Is it there's an ideological kind of continuity that's going along, and that's a more kind of subtle and sophisticated way to understand it? So I don't really claim to know. When I get to that deeper level, I'm grasping a bit, and I might not know by the end, but I want to have a clearer picture to settle some of these things in my own mind, and then, yeah, I don't know, then not do anything about it, probably. Yeah, at least I can go to my grave saying, I knew exactly the game they were playing. There we go.
That's right. At least you put the effort in. But I mean, we are basically trying to educate the audience in a proper manner, in a responsible manner as well, because there is a fine line between information and disinformation. What is true and what is not. It just seems in this day and age, in my opinion anyway, that the level of information is less and less. I mean, this is how I saw 9/11. 9/11 was basically a fight on two fronts: a war for information from the federal government and a war of disinformation from the common people who are being brainwashed or manipulated by fringe conspiracy theorists, unintentionally or intentionally, right? In terms of history, we spoke about this years ago, about the hidden history of the United States. And the less and less we know about our existence here on this earth and in this world, the less we can know, but we can believe that we know, but we can't act on it. And that leads to the quote by
Well, that's exactly it. Okay, so just to retract what I said about not doing anything about it, my hope is that I'm of the opinion that Alex Jones and the David Icks of this world have done a lot of good. Whatever bad they've done, they've done a heck of a lot of bad too. They've done good in that they've broken people out of their conceptual bubbles and say, look, there's this big nefarious conspiracy going on, and they're basically right, but they might be wrong in a lot of ways. And my thing is, okay, but we have to move on from that, right? We have to develop a more grounded and accurate way of seeing the world that says, yeah, there is this great conspiracy going on, but this is kind of how it's working, not necessarily in a cartoonish manner. And I think that the more clearly we can embody that of ourselves, the better we are communicating it. For whatever effect that has, we can't know, right? But we're more able to like see something like the COVID response and say, okay, this is clearly like not to do with preventing the spread of a virus, and clearly to do with this emerging imperial agenda, whether anyone's conscious of that agenda or not, whether it's just how people tend to react or increase their size of the pie. That's really the goal of it. And to root that criticism of the state, that conspiracy theorizing in absolutely rock solid history of like, well, look, no theory is necessary. The United States spread out and took over all these different countries and it just carried on from there. And we're still living in that history. We're not living in that rapper Zuby has a great line. It's like where people criticizing people about how they just trust governments now on pandemic response. It's like, have you read history, right? Do you think that's over and we live in some sort of a fairy tale now, right? And like, just look how it works, right? And it's like, yeah, that's my message. We're still playing. We don't live in a post-historical fairy tale. We live in history. What's going on in the Ukraine now is history. You can understand it from understanding the Crimean War and Afghanistan in the 80s and the proxy war, the Russo-Japanese war. Not like, oh, we're all perfectly nice now and we just want to have humanitarian interventions for those evil Ruskies keep ruining it for everyone. You know, that's what I'm trying to do with the series.
Richard Cox, co-host of The Darkened Hour, producer of the Energy of Empire series, and you can find him at Deep State Consciousness. Richard, thank you very much for coming on, pal.
Thank you, Adam.